Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me. And we're starting. Pathetic. Jim heard his mother-in-law grumble as he moved down the hall past the living room. He didn't ask who had caused her reaction. He already knew that. This is him. He had overheard several conversations between his new wife and his mother-in-law since her arrival from France. It was clear not only that she disapproved of her daughter's marriage, but also that she believed Monique lacked life experience. You need a man who takes control of you, Monique, not some sugary American who gives you everything you want. You don't know how wonderful it is to experience this moment forcibly, while your man takes control of you and makes you his fool. Once you're completely under his control, it's la magie, magic. Everything is as nature intended. You give yourself up and your whole body responds to it. Jim almost laughed when he heard his mother-in-law harassing his wife with her theories of human relations. But Mamo, Jim gives me many, many moments, and they are wonderful. Kind and understanding and... His wife tried to answer. Then he should understand that you need a man who will take you, will possess you and not kiss your jolie queue, beautiful ass French, every time you bend over. Her mother was almost outraged at the idea of a man idolizing his beloved. Jim met Monique in Vietnam during his second assignment as an interrogator. His mother from Quebec taught him French, and the army stuck him in Monterey, California, for a year, trying to teach him Vietnamese. Jim did not feel confident in the Asian language, but he proved himself to be an excellent interrogator in English and French. Monique worked at the French embassy in Saigon, and she and Jim were introduced by a mutual friend. By the end of his business trip, they were going to get married. It was only after returning to the States and settling in Fort Holabird, Massachusetts, that he learned that her mother in France did not approve of their marriage when she was informed about it after the fact. Jim offered to pay his mother-in-law's fare to visit her daughter, confident that when she saw how happy her daughter was, she would reconsider her disapproval. He did not understand why this did not happen. It only reinforced her disapproval and disappointment in her daughter. Jim, Mamo is to a large extent on Sumi's, slave FR, the one who needs to be dominated. I used to worry about her a lot because men used her and bullied her and then threw her aside. My father, whoever he was, put her in the hospital when he found out she was pregnant and left her there. She still mourns him. She says he was the strongest man she had ever known and still feels like he belongs to her. Monique shook her head at her mother's fetish. Jim laughed. She's crazy. He wasn't bothered by her mother's attempts to waste time on her daughter's proselytizing. Jim decided that if Mamo hadn't succeeded so far, then everything would be fine. Then Jim was informed that his special talent was needed again in Saigon, and he agreed to another 6-month business trip, although this meant extending his service life by a whole month. Now that he was married, he planned to quit, believing that being a citizen, he would be able to better support his wife and future children. Monique's mother volunteered to stay with her daughter in the States during his absence, and since this seemed to suit his wife, he agreed. In addition, Sophie has found a man who will dominate her in the garrison staff Sergeant Jason Stroud from Battalion S2. To Jim, he seemed like a real bastard, and although he didn't like the way Stroud stared at his wife, her mother seemed to be able to control him. I was worried about the bruises that were visible on Sophie's arms and on all other parts of her body. I was afraid that I would have to intervene, and with senior sergeants, this is done at your own risk. No, Monique reassured me. Mamo is very happy. That's exactly what she likes. I don't know. I never understood it, no matter how much she tried to explain it. Go do your duty. Don't worry about Mamie and me. We're going to be fine. So Jim went to Saigon and did his duty. He and Monique corresponded, and she always assured him that everything was fine, that she loved him and couldn't wait for his return. She ended each letter with the words, "I miss your love." Jim was drafted in Oakland, California, and after returning from Vietnam was sent to Oakland for military service. After graduation, he went home to Holabird to move his wife and her mother from their accommodation at the base. At the airport, Monique rushed to him, jumped into his arms and wrapped her legs around his waist. Their kiss was passionate and seemed to last forever. Finally, they moved on to the luggage to pick up Jim's duffel bag and briefcase. When Monique bent down to take the last one, her sleeve pulled up on her arm, and Jim saw 3 bruises in the form of rings on her. She was grabbed and squeezed hard enough to bruise. Jim took her hand and pulled up her sleeve all the way up to see the bruises. They weren't the only ones. Monique stared back at him, then took her hand away and pulled down her sleeve. Don't worry, Jim, it's okay. When he wanted to ask her a question, she shook her head and said, "We'll talk at home." The ride home was quiet. Scenarios flashed through Jim's mind, the main one of which was the assumption that Senior Sergeant Mamo had grabbed his wife. Anger boiled in Jim's brain. By the time they got home, he was ready to kill that bastard Stroud. Upon entering the house, Jim immediately dropped his duffel bag and turned his wife around to face him. "So, now tell me." "Jim, I love you. It's all right. Let's sit down." Monique pulled him over to the couch and sat down, then waited for Jim to join her. "Jim, I love you. I like the way you make love, but—" She paused, and there was a feeling of guilt in her gaze that made Jim's heart stop. But Momo is right. There is something about being taken without consent. Jim jumped up. "Did that bastard your mother obeys touch you?" He shouted. No, Mamie would never allow that." Monique smiled nervously. "But he has friends." This phrase pierced his heart. He picked up his duffel bag and briefcase and staggered out to his car. Monique followed him, swearing that she still loved him and that Mamo had assured her that it would not affect their marriage. Jim held back, clutching the keys in his hand until they bit into his flesh. He wanted to kill his wife, her lovers, and her damn mother. He swiftly raised his hand, but stopped its downward movement when his wife cowered. He got into the car and drove away quickly. For the first 4 months of Jim's business trip, Monique ignored her mother's urgent requests to go out and have fun, but one evening she gave up. She was bored. She did not like other wives of military personnel, and having neither children nor a job, she had nothing to do with her time. What harm can an evening out do? As it turned out, it was big. Mamo's lover brought a friend with him to accompany her, was the excuse, and he became her dancing partner. She was pleased when a man hugged her. She missed her Jim very much. Drinks flowed freely, Monique let her hair down, and her mother encouraged her. Her dancing partner's hands wandered wildly over her body, and again it was pleasant. When he suggested going outside to cool off, she agreed. When he kissed her, it didn't seem like anything special to her. What happened next is unclear, but the sergeant suddenly tore off her panties, and she ended up on the fender of a parked car. When he entered her, her first thought was that she was being raped, but then she thought about it. After all, she kissed him, enjoyed his caresses. Did she say no at all? Or did she somehow agree? And then her body began to respond. Jim had never bullied her like that. No one has ever done that. He thrust into her, hitting her cervix again and again, slapping her ass, pulling her hair. When he fully entered her and twitched, ejaculating in her womb, that very moment came, and a strong one. She did not like to make sounds during love, or rather, she had never loved before. Now she was howling. She pushed against him and moaned as the aftershocks that followed made her stagger. When she came down from a height and felt the liquid flowing out of her, her lover buttoned his pants and slapped her again. "Come on, baby, let's go back." She felt guilty and tried to object when both sergeants escorted her mother and herself into the house upon returning home. Her mother laughed as she was dragged into the bedroom. In the morning, the mother laughed even harder, remembering, to her daughter's shame, the howl that she had heard all night. After that, she found the pleasure that her mother found in submission. She loved Jim, but her body reacted to being dominated. It turned her on when she was treated like a cheater. Over the next 2 months, Stroud and Mamo brought different men, and they all dominated the young wife. Sometimes one, sometimes several. Her mother's sergeant had never made love to her, but Stroud forced Mamie to tie her up while naked, and then flogged her. It hurt, but somehow it turned her on. After the spanking, she lay there, desperate to get free, still tied up, while the two lovers furiously copulated. Watching them increased her desire, and when they brought men, she experienced that very moment, over and over again, until they untied her. Then she obeyed whoever was brought in. She knew she was thinking the wrong way. She knew that she loved Jim, but even his sweet caresses could not give her such moments as this, and even more so such as she experienced after a good love. She allowed Mamo to convince herself that Jim would understand her, that her calm husband wanted her to be happy. Everything would be fine if she explained it to Jim. So Jim returned from Vietnam, but when she tried to explain everything to him, he was gone. Jim received money for participating in the fighting and decided on a destination. He has no family. He was an only child, and his parents died during his first business trip. He inherited their Oakland Hills home and rented it out to a childhood friend and her family. He called ahead from St. Louis, and Felicia assured him that the guest room was always open for him. He couldn't figure out what to do. His wife confessed that she cheated on him, but he has no proof. So can he divorce on the basis of adultery? He didn't think so. On the other hand, they did not have any property other than his parents' house, which was his before their marriage, so there is no urgent need for any legal action. Monique and Sophie can go to hell. Let them figure it out for themselves. He moved into the guest room and soon became something of a family member. He willingly coddled two girls, Felicia and Mark, who at the age of 6 and 4, loved to climb all over Uncle Jim's house. He used the Military Reintegration Act to re-enroll in college, where he had completed 2 years before his service, and the California college system was cheap enough for payments under the Veterans Assistance Program to be enough to live on, and the rent from Felicia was added to them, although he cut it because they sheltered him. He always wanted to study engineering, and finally he got the chance. He did not go on dates, although Mark and Felicia constantly encouraged him, even to the point of inviting beautiful women to dinner. He explained that he was still married and that it was wrong. When Felicia asked about the divorce, he explained that he had no proof of adultery, and at the moment he did not care. He hoped, that eventually Monique would file a complaint because of his departure. In the meantime, he didn't want her to know where he was. Felicia shook her head. "You're not in Maryland anymore. You're in California. In 1969, Reagan signed the Family Law Act. Here you can get a divorce on the basis of irreconcilable differences. It can be anything, and does not require any evidence." Using his Army connections in Maryland, he was able to track down Sophie, who was still living with her dominant staff sergeant. From there, it was easy to find Monique, who was living with another sergeant. There she was handed the divorce papers. After receiving the divorce papers, Monique cried. She hoped that one day Jim would realize that he loved her and come back to save her. She wanted to challenge the divorce, but her master Marty stopped it. "You're going to be mine, you fool. Let that bastard divorce you." The excitement of being dominated and treated like a cheater dissipated after Jim left. The other lover Stroud had given her to was hammering her into a mattress when she realized he hadn't even talked to her, spat on her feelings, and hadn't even tried to get her wet before taking her. She realized that she was not being dominated, that she was not being treated like a cheater, and she was a cheater who now spreads her legs for anyone who wants her. Then she decided that she would change. She would work to get back to Jim no matter what it cost her. How could she be so stupid as to give up on him? She lay down on the bed and cried, lamenting what had happened and what was going to happen. She could still feel Jim, feel what the world was like with him. There's got to be a way to get back to, before all this stupidity and reconfiguration, some way to get back to Jim. But then Marty showed up. She went on a date with him a couple of times. He was stronger and more physically gifted than her other lovers. When she tried to explain to him that she was no longer free, he grabbed her by the hair and slapped her in the face. Previously, she thought it was just an expression. It turned out that it was not. Marty made her move in with him. Now he was her dominant, her master, as he insisted she call him. She belongs to him. Even the tattoo on her pubis testifies to this. He made it clear. He didn't love her. She belongs to him. She belongs to him so that he can use her as he wants, share her as he wants, abuse her as he wants. Until she received the documents, she dreamed that Jim would save her. Now it has been destroyed. When Jim graduated from California State College in San Francisco, the best gift for his graduation was the decision to divorce. He decided that before settling down, he would travel around Europe. He understood that a European travel pass was inexpensive and that by staying in hostels, he would be able to see Europe on the cheap. I packed the necessary minimum of things, kissed my foster family goodbye, and flew out of San Francisco International Airport. 2 months later, he was in Amsterdam, with almost no money, and ready to return to the States. Europe became a real adventure for him, and hostels were filled with girls from the USA and other countries who had their own adventures and who willingly agreed to bed. His new bachelor life had begun, and he was emotionally ready to start living again. He bought a return ticket the next day. With the last money he had, it was only enough for the last night at the hostel and a bus ride to the airport in the morning. He went shopping. He spent what he had left on gifts for Felicia and the girls. Toy windmills, Miffy dolls, and cheese balls were all he could afford, but he knew the girls would be happy about it. Walking along the canal, he was waving packages and suddenly heard a scream. On the other side, a little girl rolled her toy scooter too close to the edge of the canal and, losing her balance, rolled off a stone embankment into the water. Jim, without hesitation, dropped the bags and, shaking off his jacket, ran across the bridge to get closer to the girl, and then jumped off the bridge into the water. The bridge was higher, and the water was not as deep as Jim had expected, and he plopped into the water, into the mud at the bottom. His feet sank into the water, and mud clung to him as he tried to free himself and get to the girl. Eventually, he stopped being sucked in and managed to escape, losing one shoe in the mud. When he surfaced, he found himself next to a girl lying face down in the water. Turning her over, he saw that she had hit her head on a stone wall and was bleeding. He dragged her out onto the stairs where an old man was screaming in panic. Hands reached out and took the girl from him. Before getting out, he saw the scooter slowly sinking and swam to pick it up. Hands reached out to help him out. As it turned out, the girl was carried up the stone steps by the driver, and the old man limped up after them. While Jim was watching, they got into the limo and drove away. Jim smiled, left the scooter with the people on the landing, and went to get his bags and jacket. They weren't there, along with the plane ticket, wallet, money, and passport. He leaned against the railing of the bridge and wondered how he would get home. The only thing that came to mind was to contact the U.S. Embassy and see if they could help there. But he did not know where the embassy was located, in Amsterdam or The Hague. Is there a consulate there? He decided to return to the hostel to pick up his backpack and see if he could at least take a shower there. Limping, he realized that, among other problems, he needed shoes. And how to buy shoes without money? Now he wished he'd gotten one of those newfangled credit cards, American Express or MasterCard, but he'd never felt the need before. The very idea of going into debt, buying things he hasn't paid for yet. He hated her, but then he laughed. Even if he had one of these cards, it would be in his wallet, in his jacket, and it would be stolen along with the cash. As he limped along the sidewalk, dripping with water, he noticed that a car had stopped next to him. It stopped, and a man in chauffeur's livery got out. He addressed Jim in Dutch, and Jim shook his head. "English or French?" he replied. "Excuse-moi, monsieur, are you not the gentleman from the canal?" The driver used both languages in his reply. Jim laughed. "How did you find me?" he laughed in response. "I was told to look for someone in one shoe and wet. Well, that's me." Jim reluctantly got into the limo, not because he had no idea who it belonged to, but rather because it was still dripping dirty, smelly canal water. He really wanted to go back to the hostel and take a shower before he caught conjunctivitis or some other infection from dirty water. But Aldert, the driver, insisted. He will take Jim to the hostel to get his backpack, and then to his employer's house so that he can take a shower and have dinner. Since the fact that Jim did not include dinner in his budget, and that was negated by the theft of his money in a stolen jacket, Jim agreed to this plan. When Aldert pulled into the wide driveway, Jim realized that this was not a house, but a palace. It was one large detached mansion with adjoining gardens. Jim did not think that such luxury existed in Amsterdam. The old man who was with the little girl was standing on the steps of the main entrance. When Jim got out of the car, the old man came over and hugged him, despite Jim's resistance. Apparently, the Dutch are not bothered by the stinky water from the canal. The man spoke in Dutch when Aldert coughed delicately and said, "American," after which the old man easily switched to English. "My dear boy, how can I thank you? You saved Annalisa, my granddaughter. You were so fast, so brave, so gorgeous." Jim was confused by the fuss the old man had made. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just happened to be there and jumped into the water, that's all, mister. Van Ooyen, Lars Van Ooyen." He introduced himself, shaking hands. "I'm Jim Meadows. How's the little, what did you say, Annalisa?" "Yes, Annalisa. She's fine. There's a small bump on her head, but thanks to you, nothing more serious." He took Jim by the hand and led him to the house. "But let's send you to the shower and change into clean clothes." Later, dressed in his only spare clothes, without shoes, he didn't have another pair of shoes, and he decided that putting on the only remaining soaked shoe would be worse than just staying in socks. He felt decidedly underdressed in the formal dining room, in his worn jeans and white t-shirt, when dinner, was it served by a couple of footmen or something? Jim felt like he was back in the Regency era, even though the waiters, they were dressed in simple black trousers, white shirts, and, as it seemed to him, black jackets from Ike. The food prepared by Lars's chef was the most delicious he had ever tasted. Lars sympathized with Jim's losses on the channel. Aldert said that you were robbed on the canal. You have to let me make up for my losses. Well, there wasn't much. The most important loss is my passport and my plane ticket for tomorrow. I think I'll need to go to the embassy tomorrow. Otherwise, I lost some money in my jacket and gifts I bought for friends. You have nothing to worry about, sir. Jim paused. Maybe Aldert will take me to the embassy tomorrow, here or in The Hague. Your embassy is in The Hague, but we have a consulate here in Amsterdam. I'm sure they can help you there. I'll call and make an appointment for the morning, Lars replied confidently. A woman in strict brown clothes entered the room, holding the hand of a little girl, Annalisa. The girl smiled when she saw her grandfather, and recoiled from the woman to run and jump on his lap. "Grandfather!" she shouted. With a big smile on his face, the grandfather hugged the girl, and then, putting her on his lap, introduced her to Jim, telling him that he was the brave man who jumped into the canal to save her. Jim was embarrassed by the praise again, but the girl jumped off her grandfather's lap and ran to Jim to hug him tightly. Then, looking at him intently, she said in a very adult voice, "Thank you, sir." Jim laughed and said, "You're welcome, miss. You sound just like an American." She replied indignantly, "I am an American. I live in Delaware." Suddenly, there was the sound of a door slamming, and someone called Annalisa. The girl's face lit up. She screamed, "Mom!" and ran out of the room. This was followed by the sound of a dropped handbag and loud kisses. Annalisa soon returned, holding the hand of a young woman in her 20s or 30s. Lars got up and went to hug his daughter. When the greetings were over, Lars led the woman to Jim, who also got up and stood next to his chair. "And this is Jim Meadows, to whom we owe the salvation of our Annalisa. Jim, this is my daughter and Annalisa's mother, Mila Borden." Mila held out her hand to Jim and began to thank him warmly, and Jim again insisted that he hadn't really done much. Finally, everyone sat down again at the table where Mila and Annalisa were now having dinner. Jim has to go to the consulate tomorrow to replace his passport, but I think first we have to take him to Pakkin tomorrow to buy new shoes. He lost his own in the canal. He can't walk in one shoe, can he? Lars teased. Mila laughed. And I was surprised at the socks on my feet. Even for an American, it looks too frivolous. Jim blushed. Pakkin? Is this a shoe store? Well, they sew all our shoes. They'll have a date for you before we go to the consulate. I have a pair of slippers that you can wear until then. Then Lars added, Jim also lost his plane ticket home. Someone stole his stuff while he was in the canal. A plane ticket is not a problem. He can come back on the corporate plane with Annalisa and me. That's the least we can do for our hero, isn't it, Annalisa? She asked her daughter, who nodded enthusiastically. Do you mind delaying your return for a week, Jim? Before returning, I would like to spend some time with my father. Of course, no one is waiting for me now, but I need to go to California, not Delaware, although I'm sure I can get home from there, he admitted. Lars intervened. I'm sure we can get you home. In the meantime, you will stay with us as a guest. When Jim tried to object, he continued, and this is final, no arguments. The next day, Jim got a shoe order at Pakkin, but was given a pair of his size to meet his immediate needs. He was amazed at how she was sitting. These are the best shoes he's ever had. When he left, the employee assured him that the other shoes would be ready in 3 days. When he objected to Lars that it was too expensive, Lars simply said, Nonsense, my boy. Jim was surprised when Lars was received at the consulate by the consul general himself. An attaché took him by the arm, and he was urgently given a replacement passport with a new photo taken by a consular photographer. The consul general assured Lars that the passport would be ready and delivered to his house the very next day. On the way home, Lars stopped at several shops and bought expensive gifts for Felicia and the girls to replace the stolen ones. When Jim realized how much the gifts would cost, he protested, but Lars insisted. A necklace for Felicia and bracelets for girls. Toys that filled the large trunk of the limo. They did not forget Mark either, giving him a Patek Philippe watch. Jim objected again. He thought that Felicia and Mark could use the cost of these gifts to buy several houses in Auckland, but nothing could convince the owner. Nothing can be too much for the friends of my granddaughter's hero. Finally, Jim got through to Lars, threatening to leave if Lars didn't slow down. Lars was visibly shaken by this threat. Please don't do this. Mila and Annalisa will be hurt if you leave them. His eyebrows went up. And they'll blame me. Jim smiled at the old man's stunned expression. Lars, please, no more words about heroism and no more awards. Helping me get a passport, putting me up in your house, and helping me return home is more than enough. Please return all these gifts. They are not necessary." Lars agreed, but did not understand this American. He saved the most precious thing in Lars's life, Annalisa, but refused to thank him. Having agreed to return the extravagant gifts, he secretly planned to send them to Mark and Felicia at the address indicated in Jim's passport. Jim found out that Lars owns LVO Holdings, which was a family business, but ranked 12th on the list of the largest Dutch companies. Mila married an American, John Borden, Annalisa's father, and ran LVO's American operations from Delaware. Although she returned home out of concern for her daughter, she now has to deal with business at headquarters while she is in the country. But she had enough time to spend the rest of the week showing Jim her country, taking him and Annalisa around Amsterdam, The Hague, the beaches of Zeeland, Gouda, Edam, and Limburg, until Annalisa begged not to watch cheese-making anymore. Mila laughed and noted that cheese is very important for their country, which is rich in dairy products. Jim found Mila surprisingly easy to talk to, especially considering her upbringing in wealth and position in the corporation. He asked Lars about her position in the company, and Lars proudly talked about his daughter's virtues and business acumen. Jim was impressed. On the last night in Holland, Lars and Mila sat Jim down at the table and asked him what his plans for the future were. He honestly replied that he had not decided yet. He has just graduated from college, but after 8 years in the Army and 4 years of college, he is 30 years old and has no experience in engineering. He doesn't expect employers to come knocking on his door, but his plan is to look for a job as soon as he returns to California. Of course, Lars and Mila offered Jim a job. They own factories in Delaware where they could use a reliable engineer. Jim thought about it. They are good people, and as far as he understood their corporate philosophy, this kindness extends to their employees. He was about to agree when Mila added, "The salary will be $150,000 a year, plus benefits." Jim was stunned. A good salary for an engineer would probably be less than $70,000. Damn, he thought. This is just another bribe to the hero. They don't really need me. They just feel the need to reward me. Jim stood up. "I'm tired, and it's going to be a long day tomorrow. I'm going to bed." He looked at Lars and Mila and shook his head. "No, thanks for the job offer, but no. I think I should look for a job myself." With that, he turned around and left. Lars and Mila stared at each other in amazement. They tried to make the job offer as attractive as possible. They could not have imagined that Jim would refuse such an offer. Lars shook his head. "Why would he refuse? Haven't we offered enough? He is a good man. I really hoped that he would join us." Mila sighed. "No, Dad, I think we offered too much. Jim is a man who wants to be appreciated for who he is. He doesn't want to be bought, and it seems to him that we are too generous in gratitude and appreciation for saving Annalisa." She sighed. "I like this man. He reminds me of John." Lars liked his son-in-law. He was not very rich by himself, but he still refused to accept any help or financial income from his wife's relatives. He was proud to provide his wife and child with everything they needed. John believed that Mila's money was her money, and she could do whatever she wanted with it, and his duty was to provide what was necessary for life. Both Mila and Lars thought he was funny, but Lars had to respect his independent son-in-law. When he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, Lars spent a fortune trying to provide John with the best treatment, but to no avail. He passed away 2 years ago. Lars, Mila, and Annalisa are still grieving for him. Sophie stared at her daughter in shock. Her sergeant was transferred to Fort Huachuca in Arizona when the U.S. Army Intelligence School, USAINT, was transferred there. Sophie hasn't seen her daughter in over a year. Now she was shocked. "What have you done?" Monique stood there with tears in her eyes. She had a tattoo of a slave collar on her neck and card spikes on both ankles and her left shoulder. "How could you do this to yourself?" Monique looked at her mother through tears. "You, Mom, told me yourself that I have to surrender to a dominant man, that this is the only way I can truly realize myself. She forced me to give up a loving man for someone who beats me and pimps me. I told you to obey. Not be enslaved, you stupid girl," Sophie replied indignantly. How dare her daughter accuse her of ruining her life? She has been an example to the girl all her life, but she does not see the difference between their situations. "Nonsense," she hissed. "When I resist Marty, he hits me. I have bruises and scars from his blows. My ribs are broken where he kicked me. and twice he intentionally broke my fingers. I hate him. But I have no money. I have nowhere to go. I have nothing. Nothing. Monique pulled at her hair and moaned in despair. You're coming with me. Stroud is being transferred to Fort Meade to join the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. If Marty objects, I'll ask Stroud to report him to the Army Command, and he'll be kicked out. She called Stroud and asked him to come over to help move her daughter. Jim was impressed by the Learjet corporate jet that carried him, Mila, and Annalisa back to the States. The crew consists of 3 people, the pilot, co-pilot, and steward, 3 separate sleeping cabins, as well as the main cabin, where there are ministerial chairs, a sofa, and a bar with a full set of drinks. A real luxury. They took off after 18 o'clock before saying goodbye to Lars with tears, after which Aldert took them to a private hangar. We had dinner on the plane and planned to go to bed after sleeping through the entire flight. Annalisa insisted on sitting on Jim's lap after dinner to delay bedtime as long as possible. When she dozed off, Jim carefully carried her to her assigned cabin and left Mila to put her to bed. When Mila returned, she offered Jim a drink for the night, which he gladly accepted. He had already appreciated Lars's taste in whiskey. Handing Jim the glass, she apologized. I'm sorry for the job offer. It was awkward on our part, but we really wanted you to join us. You made an impression on my dad, but this old man, believe it or not, is not easy to impress. I appreciate it. I really liked him too. Both he and his family are very impressive. Jim smiled at Mila, clearly admiring her. But you're all so amazing that I just can't figure it out. I would be lost in your world. With that, he drained his glass, put it back in its place, and reached for Mila's hand. Without hesitation, he raised his hand to his lips and kissed it. Then he smiled again and went to his bunk. It took a minute before Mila realized she wasn't breathing and suddenly inhaled sharply. There's something about Jim. An hour later, Jim woke up to a hand brushing the hair from his forehead and lips gently touching his lips. When he opened his eyes, he saw a thoughtful Mila dressed in a black negligee looking at him. I couldn't let you go without saying that you touched my heart. What? Jim rubbed his face, trying to come to his senses enough to understand this woman. Ik hou van jou. I love you, Gall, she whispered, leaning forward and kissing him again. That woke Jim up. Shocked, he leaned back against the bulkhead. He didn't understand what she said, but it sounded too intimate to be innocent, especially in that black negligee. You're married. But what about your husband? She already knew about his wife, he told her. How could she think that he would do this to another husband? Jim, my husband died 2 years ago. Cancer, she whispered softly. Jim sat motionless, absorbing the new information. However, while he told her about Monique and Sophie, she did not talk about her husband. He watched as a tear appeared in Mila's eyes and ran down her cheek. He reached out and caught her with his finger. She squeezed his hand and pressed it to her cheek. But you hardly know me. How can you? Jim stopped. What did you say? What? I love you, Mila whispered, moving onto the bed. 2 years later, Annalisa kissed Dad goodnight as Mila and Jim were preparing for dinner and a play in Baltimore with Mila's business partners. Unlike John Borden, Jim understood that he could not finance a lifestyle at the level that Mila and his daughter, which he considered Annalisa, deserved. He resigned himself to luxury, but limited what his wife and father-in-law could give him. He was seduced by the wonderful Pakkind shoes. He did not understand how he could even walk in other shoes, and because of the dinners and meetings to which he accompanied his wife, he allowed her to purchase a wardrobe. Now the shoes were complemented by Savile Row suits, custom shirts from Hong Kong, silk ties from Japan, and casual clothes that cost more than anything Jim could remember in his entire life. But he decided that compromises and sacrifices were necessary in marriage, so he would have to accept and endure. While his wife held power in the corporate world and her family was worth more than the GDP of some countries, Jim enjoyed working as an engineer at a factory near Wilmington, earning $77,000 a year. He used his salary to take his wife and Annalisa on vacations and day trips, although he used a corporate plane. He was well employed, worked where he liked and did what he understood. He had a wife and daughter whom he loved, and he was immensely happy. Mark and Felicia thought he was crazy. As a belated wedding gift, he gave them his house and sent gifts to their daughters, but he couldn't compete with their adopted grandfather. Several times a year, Lars comes to Europe with Annalisa. All 3 girls were like sisters, and Lars liked to spoil them all. Mark especially thought Jim was crazy. He had no problem wearing his Patek Philippe watch, and Felicia adored her necklace. Although when she found out how much it cost, she rarely wore it. It is stored in a safe deposit box. As Jim and Mila were leaving the Martic restaurant in Baltimore, Mila felt Jim suddenly pull her towards him. When she looked at what was going on, she saw that he was looking at two women walking along the sidewalk. When they saw Jim, they also stopped abruptly. The youngest of them gasped, "Jim." Mila felt her husband make an effort to relax. "Monique," Jim said flatly and expressionlessly. Mila was startled to learn the name of Jim's ex-wife. She stared at the woman, examining the tattoos on her neck and ankles. According to Jim's description, she expected to see something completely different. Monique was wearing a shapeless dress with long sleeves and a bodice buttoned up to her neck. She looked exhausted and unhappy, perhaps even more so after meeting her ex-husband, but the lines of grief on her face were nothing new. A beautiful tattoo. Mila was surprised by the pettiness that Jim showed. "I hope you found the joy that you were looking for in domination." Mila realized that her Jim was not petty, he was in shock. Monique's face was haggard. She turned and, sobbing, ran in the opposite direction. Sophie watched her daughter go and then turned to Jim. "It wasn't necessary, you pathetic man." Mila, knowing the story of this woman, blurted out, "No, not pathetic. Sensitive, sympathetic. Jim is a good man. It's you and your daughter who are pathetic." She sat up and pulled Jim to her. "Not my husband. And he dominates me. He dominates me with tenderness, with love, with care. Go away, you wicked, vile woman." While Mila dragged her stunned husband into the limo, Sophie could only stare at her in amazement, and then finally turned around to find her daughter and take care of her. As they pulled away from the curb, Mila snuggled up to her husband, wrapping him in her arms. "What do you say we skip the performance? I can apologize to the Brown Millers tomorrow." Jim clung to his wife and, breathing heavily, suppressed a sob. "I loved her. How could she do this to herself? Why Mila?" Her strong husband was shaking with sobs. Mila hugged him tightly, deeply worried about her husband. "Should I have left? Did I do this to her? Would I have been able to save her if I had stayed?" Mila pushed her husband away from her to look into his eyes. "No. How can you think that? It's not your fault, it's only her and her mother's fault. If you had stayed, it would have ruined you too. You did the only thing you could." She could tell from his eyes that he still felt guilty. He is happy, but Monique is destroyed. It didn't give him pleasure. It hurt him to see how the one he loved was suffering. Mila's heart was bursting with love for this man. What if we help her? Maybe to a psychiatrist. Maybe someone can remove these disgusting tattoos. Whatever she needs, we'll help her, okay? What do you say? She pulled Jim back to her and rested her head on his chest, hearing his breathing and the pounding of his heart. "Do you want to do this?" "Yes, please," Jim sighed. "Can we go home now?" "I want to hug you and Annalisa. I need to remember how good life is." Mila decided to save the surprise she had planned for Jim for another evening. She can't wait too long, otherwise it will become obvious that Annalisa will have a brother or sister. In the end, Monique's wish came true. Jim came to save her, even though they never saw each other again. Mila entrusted everything to third parties, and thanks to consultations, tattoo and piercing removal, as well as some plastic surgery to eliminate scars on her body and buttocks, Monique began to find, if not happiness, then balance in her life. She never got married, and she didn't go on dates anymore. She returned to work and got a job in Washington as a translator, dealing mainly with legal documents. It was very similar to what she had been doing at the Saigon embassy all these years. In her spare time, she worked as a volunteer at a charity foundation for women affected by violence. It didn't surprise anyone that she didn't date or talk to anyone at work. Everyone believed that a single woman of her age, between 45 and 50 years old, had long since turned into an old maid. No one would have believed that she was barely over 30.